Good evening. Welcome to Facts. Once again, another Monday night is on your live stream, whether you're joining us today from YouTube or Facebook or other social media outlets. Later, those will be able to listen to this on Spotify. We're jumping into the Gospel of John tonight. We finished the synoptic accounts. We covered just about two per gospel. And then we had a review last week going over the synoptic accounts. But tonight we're going to actually look at John, and then we'll carry that into next week. And I'll show you that itinerary for upcoming events. But before we get into the itinerary and things like that, while you're joining in with us, make sure to share these videos and to share them with those that are interested, different pages, as well as friends you may know that have questions or maybe have pushback on these subjects. Our goal is to continue to grow as a ministry and distribute information for you as a part of Explain International. Facts is not an independent show. It is a part of a bigger network of apologists and those that are training as apprentices to be apologists. And we're doing various discussions, whether it's Old Testament conundrums or theology questions of Christology and Christ as being deity, looking at different elements of the different cults and religions. We have numerous things coming out regularly, both in video and written for you at Explain International. If you have not been on our website and seen the different things that are being put out there between the country of Malaysia and here in the U.S., please follow us, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter or on Instagram and different platforms, because we are also a part of a bigger group as well within the church realm with City Light churches. You have City Light Asheville, City Light Seattle, as well as City Light Malaysia. And we're working with different apologists and apprentices all the way into Luxembourg, the Philippines, Malaysia, the U.S., England. So we have a variety of backgrounds and languages that we're pouring into, and guys are writing in their own languages as well as into their national places, such as the Malaysia places and Philippines, and those that are doing Arabic. We have a guy on our team, Tyler Steinman, who has a ministry and he's working with it towards the Turkish language. He's converted out of Islam. We have a few converted out of Islam. We also have Eric Wendt, who is converted out of Mormonism. So we have quite a few guys and girls on this team who have extraordinary background stories. So check out the work they're putting out there, both in written and video form at explaininternational.com, as well as on the different social media outlets. Again, today we're jumping into John's gospel, but one thing I wanted to do is actually add a nuance to this than what we have been, because more information comes in and study continues and we learn more and more as we go on. And one of the things that I wanted to do is a quick review of Matthew, because I gave a hypothesis not long ago, and I want to revisit that hypothesis. Recently, Jonathan Sheffield, one of the apologists, debated Dr. Goodacre on the discussion of Matthew and Mark. And though we have a difference of view on the timing of each book, even amongst our team, there's different views by our apologists, which is what we welcome. We don't want to be a one-size-fits-all thing, but we do at the same time want to share new information as we learn it. And Jonathan shared with me a few statements in history that actually validated my position more so than his. We're praying for him to convert over to my position. One day he'll see the light. Until then, his research that was shared with me, I'm actually going to translate into this today. But some of this new data involves Matthew, how I broke it up into two categories. If you remember from those videos, and if you haven't seen them yet, please go back. There's two videos discussing the content of Matthew's gospel. My overall position is that Matthew's gospel was first, but it was not the Greek version of it. Rather, it was the Hebrew or perhaps Aramaic gospel account that we do not have any longer. And that Mark was actually the first Greek account. And then after that, Luke. And then later, the apostles translated into Greek from the Hebrew Aramaic Matthew, and then some. and then taking an account to all of the eyewitnesses, almost a group effort gospel, and published that gospel using the primary witness of Matthew and his material that he probably collected from following Jesus in his ministry, and then taking it and actually building on that with other apostolic witnesses, and then later John. And so that's been my position of Matthew, is that it goes Matthew, Hebrew, Matthew, that is, and then Mark, Luke, and a translated, more in-depth version of Matthew, which is the one that we use today. That would have been the apostolic sent one that was transmitted throughout the churches, and then later John. But to continue to validate that hypothesis, let's reconsider Papias's statement, but then also add some nuances into it, reminding us of what Papias said. If you're watching this, you'll see it on the screen. If not, you're listening on Spotify or other venues that allow you just to listen to the audio. Listen carefully. I'll try to read slow. Therefore, Matthew put the sayings, or the logia, in an ordered arrangement. Now, remember, that was in comparison to Mark, which he said was not done in a particular order, in the Hebrew language, or that is dialect, so it could be Aramaic. But each person interpreted, and we talked about how Papias used that term both for Matthew and Mark, and it appears that he's using it more in the sense of translating. So he translated as best as he could. The problem is, Eusebius preserved these words for Papias, so we don't know the full depths of what he is saying when it comes to each person, like which individuals are this? We don't know, because we don't have Papias's work except for what Eusebius gave us. And he didn't give us the full context before that paragraph or after that paragraph. All he goes is into Mark, a very short statement like this on Matthew, and then that's it. So we're left to guess, but we could use a little bit of history here to help us. Consider the statement of Athanasius of Alexandria, the bishop there, who was at the Council of Nicaea, but he was not on the council as a bishop at the time. He was learning, later would become a phenomenal bishop dealing with the heresy of Arianism. Anytime you have free minutes on your hand to do a research of Athanasius, read the works of Athanasius. He's a tremendous bishop. But he said, he talked about the translation that we're talking about. He recognized that Matthew was originally done in the Hebrew dialect, but that later it was translated. Now, Papias, in that one phrase preserved, didn't give specific names, but Athanasius had a tradition that one of those names was James, the brother of Jesus, that this was later translated by James. Now, it's very possible, but we don't know outside of that witness. Now, there's other guys that took a stab at this as well. Theodorus potentially attributed the translation work to Barnabas. In fact, listen to the words here. The relics of the apostle Barnabas were found in Cyprus under a carob tree, and on his breast there was the Gospel of Matthew, written by Barnabas's own hand. Now, there's a lot that could be debated there, whether that was translation. Are they saying that he published it? Are they saying that he did his own work of this and that he did write the Gospel of Matthew? It would indicate more that he is referring to the fact that he had his own translated version of the Gospel of Matthew, which would have been in Greek. So some would attribute some of Matthew to Barnabas, as Theodorus did as well. Theophylacte and the Epiphanius attributed the translation to John, interestingly enough, which is why we're going to be introducing John today. But there are many, including the Byzantine area, that attributed the translation of Matthew's Hebrew to Greek from the Apostle John. Consider this from Epiphanius. The Gospel according to Matthew is written by him, that is Matthew, in the East, with Hebraic language and letters, and was published in Jerusalem and translated by John. Now, I don't know if I agree with this tradition, although it's interesting to consider, because if you read John's gospel and it's Greek, it is not exactly like the Greek you see in Matthew. And again, we note that if Mark is the first Greek gospel, it is clear that Matthew would be following much of the grammatical structure of Mark, using almost word-for-word statements at times. But nonetheless, it's hard to believe that it would be just John, because it's very different from his epistles. It's very different from the gospel. But what we see here, though, that I want to focus on is part of the hypothesis that I shared with you weeks ago, is that it's not about one apostle. I don't think Matthew's gospel is about one apostle, although the credit's going to go to Matthew because it seems to be from his sources. It seems to be from his eyewitness testimony from a primary standpoint. He did publish his own gospel in the Hebrew or Aramaic dialect, but at the end of the day, we don't know exactly what that said. And some would say, well, they're equal, the Greek and the Hebrew. The problem with that is what I continue to bring up is that Jerome had a copy of this from the library of Caesarea, and he made it clear that he actually did not, when he's quoting it, have the exact same Greek that we do in our Matthew, because when he was translating certain sections, there were stories about James the Just, interestingly enough, and his encounter with Jesus after. Now, it seems like the Ebionites and other groups took Matthew's gospel and corrupted it to the nth degree. And some could argue that Jerome was looking at a corrupted version, but he didn't say that. Rather, he said this was the same gospel that had been dealt with Origen. And so Origen had also seen this gospel too, according to Jerome. So there was much interest in this Hebrew version because it was not identical to the Greek version. And so I would say that what the original Matthew was Matthew's personal eyewitness testimony of the life and ministry of Jesus. And much of that was contained in the Greek version, but it was a group compiled testament that was sent out on behalf of the entire apostolic group. So my concluding remarks are this. My hypothesis, mostly due to the Didache, which again, we don't have time for this in this session, but go back and watch the 2 sessions on Matthew, is that Matthew's gospel was first published in Hebrew or Aramaic before the other accounts. Later on, perhaps in the early 60s, it was translated and edited by the apostolic witnesses in Jerusalem or Antioch. Now, the reason I say early 60s is going back to the witness of Irenaeus, who said it happened while Paul and Peter were in Rome, which could not have been any time before 58. So I believe it would have been in the early 60s. And it was translated and edited by the apostolic witnesses in the areas of Antioch and Jerusalem in order to publish a collective narrative of the life and ministry of Jesus. This would have included Matthew's eyewitness account primarily. And then in addition to that, of course, one of the star witnesses, Peter's eyewitness testimony found in the written text of Mark, and perhaps along with his oral traditional statements and other living apostles at the time. So that is my view. That is my hypothesis of Matthew. I would list the Greek version of it as finished, published, and sent on behalf of all the apostles that were still living, that were distributed from Antioch and Jerusalem into the other churches, which, if you think about it, Matthew is one of the earliest attested gospels in the early church. Most quoted. I mean, you do not have to look any further than the Didache itself, or even how Polycarp, which gospel did he use the most, or looking at Clement and which one he used. These early fathers were fond of Matthew's gospel, and in the case of the Didache, I referred to it as the gospel of the Lord, almost as if it was a collective group speaking on behalf of Jesus from what they heard and saw, rather than just being the gospel of Matthew himself. So let's jump into this. Let's go into today, our next move from the Gospel of John. So that was introductory, just to kind of give, because we want to take time in our sessions to make sure we're not just boggling ourselves down to one thing, but I want us to understand that we are growing in our knowledge of this, and we should ever be learning in such a way that we adjust and adapt and change or add on more information and add more arguments we didn't have before. And to me, these interesting perspectives that multiple guys are being depicted as the ones who actually translated it. It could be that they're all true. It could be that James did have a part in it, that John did have a part in it, that Barnabas did have a part in it. It could be that they all had a part in it because it was a group effort, collected gospel. But when it comes to John, it's a little bit more complex. In fact, I thought John would be rather easy, even starting into my doctoral work, studying John. My first doctorate was primarily focused on Lucan material, both in Luke and Acts and a good bit of Hebrews. But looking at it from the last research that I did, I was shocked to find how difficult John's gospel is to pin down, especially for a date. But there are indicators, especially for when it comes to the timing in which John wrote. But let's start with some of the earliest witnesses. If you're looking at the screen here, you can read along. If it's too difficult, listen carefully. And those on Spotify, listen as well. Note this in the Muratorian fragment, late 2nd century, says the fourth gospel is that of John. Now, this is not disputed. John is universally seen as the last gospel, not the second to last, not first or second. And it's certainly seen as just always, as Origen told us, universally under heaven, the churches only received 4 gospels from the apostles, just 4. They were undisputed, is what what Origen said. So we need to take that in and think that through. But there is no universal opinion outside of John's gospel was 4th. And he was one of the disciples. Now, when his fellow disciples and bishops entreated him, he said, "Fast ye now with me for the space of 3 days, and let us recount to each other whatever may be revealed to us." So what we have here is an ancient tradition of why the Gospel of John was published. Apparently, his fellow disciples that were still living, we'll find out from another document that it was likely Andrew, which actually this document will tell us as well, and other friends of his that were bishops, perhaps Polycarp, who he trained and left at Smyrna. But when we're looking at this account, it's telling us words that are being recorded from John's mouth. He was being pushed. Hey, you should put together an account of Jesus. And he almost resisted, but they decided to pray and fast for 3 days. And whatever was revealed to them, they were going to do. It says, and on the same night, it was revealed to Andrew, that is Peter's brother, one of the apostles, that John should narrate all things in his own as they called them to mind. What marvel is it then that John brings forward these several things so constantly in his epistles, also saying in his own person what we have seen with our eyes and heard with our ears and our hands have handled, that we have written, which is an account particularly of 1 John. So they're recognizing that the gospel account of John and the epistle of 1 John is John. Now, I shared earlier that it is my belief that in agreement that there seems to be 2 Johns, a John the Elder and John the Apostle. And I know that some conflate them and say they're one. I actually hold the position they're 2. And I actually take what Jerome said and consider the fact that 1 John and John's gospel and the apocalypse are all John the Apostle, whereas 2nd and 3rd John were John the Elder. Now, I'm not willing to die on that hill, but there's always this connection to the fact that the gospel writer and the epistle writer of 1 John are the same. Once more, we see measurement of that here in this fragment of the Muratorian, which is one of the earliest collected canonical lists, by the way, if you haven't been following us in the other programs. What we have seen with our eyes and heard with our ears, that's the eyewitness testimony that heard the words of Jesus with physical ears, seen with physical eyes, touched with a physical hand. And so he says, for thus he professed himself not only to be an eyewitness, but a hearer. And besides that, the historian of all the wondrous facts. And I love that word's in the Muratorian fragment. It goes along with our program facts concerning the Lord in their order. So let's get the summary of that. John was the 4th gospel written by the apostle, and it was motivated by his friends, particularly the one that pushed it over was after fasting and praying, Andrew had it revealed to him that it should happen, which is interesting in of itself because Andrew is not mentioned very often in the other gospels, but in John's, he's mentioned frequently throughout the gospel. So it is a good chance that Andrew was a major role in producing the Gospel of John by giving his eyewitness account in addition to his own. So it's very possible, and what indicates here is that Andrew is still alive even when John was writing this account. The writer said was a hearer, an eyewitness, and a historian of the events that took place. That's also in summary. Also, he wrote them down in an orderly account. This is similar to how Papias described Matthew in comparison to Mark. This seems to be consistent based on the chronology. Now, what that means is John's gospel is chronologically in order. And Papias talked about that in relation to Mark not being in specific order, but whereas Matthew was in a specific order. but that John is even more detailed. And it's very easily seen very early on. When you go to the story where Jesus changes the water and the wine, John made it clear this is the first miracle. He is counting from the earliest attestation of miracles that the synoptics did not do. So he is even more orderly than Matthew himself. Now, we've looked at this document as well, 2nd and 3rd century, known as the Anti-Marcionite Prologue. And this is what it says about the Gospel of John, which I think you might find interesting. It might be a little bit out there, but I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued. The Gospel of John was revealed and given to the church by John while still in the body, meaning he was still alive. Now, that needs to be understood because often we excuse him as being dead and somebody else writing this in the 2nd and late 2nd century. But the testament here is that John was still alive, and that just as Papias of Hierapolis, the close disciple of John. Now, we've seen already from Eusebius' testimony that he was a hearer. Irenaeus kind of plays this out as well. He was familiar with John the Apostle. Apparently, he had heard him. But the Marcionite Prologue takes it a step further. Not only says he heard him, but he was a close disciple. He was somebody who was saved, perhaps, under the ministry of John the Apostle. But he apparently related stories that we, again, do not have. Very few have been preserved by some of the early church fathers and historians. But he related this, that in the last 5 books. Now, remember, Papias wrote 5 writings or summaries of the ministry of Jesus, and he was very familiar with the written text and apparently familiar with the Gospel of John, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it says, indeed, he wrote down the gospel while John was dictating carefully. So what the Anti-Marcionite Prologue is actually saying to us is that Papias was his scribe. Now, I know that some would have a major problem with this, but Richard Bauckham actually entertains this concept at one point. And Bauckham is a tremendous scholar in the Anglican Church, and I recommend his book to anybody. And he has done his entire research, and I think his dissertation was on John's Gospel. He has a theory of John's Gospel I don't follow. I get it. He makes a wonderful argument, beautiful argument, that John's Gospel was not written by John the Apostle, but by John the Elder. And he uses Papias a lot for that, and statements like this, that Papias would have been familiar with it. Now, again, I can't follow him to that nth degree, but it is intriguing and very entertaining in some ways. But at the same time, I just cannot follow the full end of his logic because the historical accounts are universally for the apostle being the writer. And even in this one, though Papias is involved and had inside information to the point of actually being the scribe that was writing what John said, whoever it is would have been a phenomenal writer. Now, keep this in mind. John would have written this in Ephesus, and that is pretty commonly known in the early church as well. Ephesus would have been full of wonderful writers, tremendous scholars and scribes. John would not have lacked an amanuensis or a scribe or scribes, plural, to have written an account so strategic. And keep that in mind, by the way. People say, well, do you really believe that a fisherman would have been able to write so wonderfully in Greek and so constructed and historical? Well, in 2 cases. One, he left the fishing business and became an apprentice of Jesus, and that would have involved much training. And if John was as old as what others are indicating at the end of his life writing this, then yeah, I can believe it. Anybody could have left. He was probably just a teenager when he left the fishing business of his father Zebedee and followed Jesus. When he left that and became a follower of Jesus, that would have been not only learning the ways of Jesus, but learning how to share the ways of Jesus, write the ways of Jesus, teach the ways of Jesus. He would have been dedicating himself to instruction and writing and teaching, and he would have been able to do it by the time he was a young teenager, early 20s, to the time he's 70, 80, or 90 years old. He certainly had plenty of time to learn and educate himself well. But that's not the only thing. The other thing is, as I just stated, numerous scribes, and you got guys perhaps like Papias who wrote 5 volumes. So these were wonderful writers. He was surrounded by wonderful writers in the city of Ephesus itself. So let's go back to this. Could Papias himself, who was just brought up in the anti-Marcionite prologue, have been one of the witnesses that John existed? You say, well, according to Eusebius, we don't know because Eusebius didn't tell us. He just mentioned Matthew and Mark. Yeah, he was obviously familiar with the apocalypse of John, given the fact that Eusebius could not stand his position on it because Papias took the 1,000-year reign as literal, whereas Eusebius took it as figurative. So he kind of mocked Papias for this position. But Papias would have been familiar with the Gospel of John. Could it be that he did write it or was familiar or around it or there when it was being written? Maybe. Here's something to consider in Papias. Remember what he said, quoted by Eusebius, "If then anyone came who had been a follower of the elders, I question him in the regard of the words of the elders." What, Andrew, Peter, and what was said by Philip or Thomas or James or John? Now, note this. Papias appears to be familiar with the Gospel of John. You say, from what? Based on what? As Richard Bauckham points out in his book, the first 6 names occur in the same order in which the characters appear in John's Gospel. Now, don't miss that. Andrew, Peter, Philip, Thomas, James, and John are the exact order that John's Gospel teaches and lays them out by their character in their appearances in the scenes of John's Gospel. That list is found nowhere else, especially not in the Synoptics. Not in that order. And what it could be is a couple things. One, these could have been major helps when it came to John writing his gospel. Perhaps his main witnesses that nudged him to write this as we've seen, Andrew is one of those, could have been, and no, Peter would have been dead at this point, and we'll talk about why in a minute, but he would have used Mark's gospel, which I believe he was very familiar with with Mark and Luke more so than Matthew, but definitely all 4 Gospels were connected in a lot of ways spiritually, but physically, it seems like John was familiar with all 3 of the Synoptics, which we'll talk about in a second. But this is interesting. It could be that Papias knew of this, and if that is the case, Papias being the time that he was, John's Gospel would have been early, and it could be that the anti-Marcionite prologue is onto something. We don't know, and we cannot be dogmatic about it. But let's consider Irenaeus. He's another important disciple of John. Papias was a disciple of John, whereas Irenaeus was a second generation. So Polycarp was trained, commissioned by John, left as a bishop of Smyrna. He trained a young man named Irenaeus. And Irenaeus, at the end of the 2nd century, wrote about these, and we've used him frequently in the other 3 Gospels. Notice what he says about John. Then after the publication of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John, again the 4th, the disciple of the Lord, clarifying which one wrote it, who had even rested on his breath to clarify not only who wrote it, but the description of him in the gospel narrative, the one who laid on Jesus' breast, himself also gave forth the gospel while he was living at Ephesus in Asia. Again, so we have a location, we have the attestation he's alive. This was written by him. He's the author. And he was in a particular location. Tertullian, the lawyer, says, we lay it down as our first position that the evangelical testament has apostles for its authors. Of the apostles, therefore, John and Matthew first instill faith into us, whilst the apostolic men, being that of Luke and Mark, renew it afterwards. So he's looking at it as, so 2 apostles wrote, and that's John and Matthew. And then also you had 2 apostolic men, which are Luke and Mark, renew this. Now, he's not talking about order here, and you got to get the whole context of Tertullian there and against Marcion, that we don't have time to go into the context. He's not saying that's the order of the Gospels. He's giving supremacy to its authority as well as its apostolic positions. Clement of Alexandria, we'll look at 2 quotes from him. The first one says, of all those who had been with the Lord, only Matthew and John left us their recollection. Similar to what Tertullian was saying, that 2 apostles actually wrote themselves. And tradition says that they took the writing out of necessity. They did it because there was a need for it. John, it is said, used all the time a message which was not written down, meaning it was probably oral, and at last took to writing the following cause. The three gospels which had been written down before, again, confirming that John's the fourth gospel, were distributed to all, including himself, meaning he had access to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It is said he welcomed them and testified to their truth, but said that there was only lacking to the narrative the account of what was done by Christ at first and at the beginning of the preaching, which is consistent with what we've seen. He went back to the earliest miracle that the synoptics did not. He went back to the eternality of Jesus, which the others didn't fully come into, because he comes out the gates. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He comes out firing in the eternality of Jesus Christ. They say accordingly that John was asked to relate in his own gospel the period passed over in silence by formal evangelists. And that is consistent. He does. He hits areas the others do not. He didn't feel the need to repeat them. There were already three. He felt the need to fill in gaps and bring out the spiritual elements, which is what Clement says later. Notice this. But John, the last of all, seeing that what was bodily sent forth in the Gospels, being Matthew, Mark, and Luke, meaning they focused on the physical side of this ministry of Jesus. They followed his travels. They followed his works, his person, his claims, his teachings. But on the entreaty of his intimate friends, again, that is connected and consistent with the Muratorian fragment that we have Andrew, others, and bishops saying, look, you need to write this down. And they prayed about it and fasted for 3 days. And inspired by the Spirit, composed a spiritual gospel. Now, that doesn't mean that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then the synoptics have some sort of non-spiritual behavior in it, and that it's only physical. The concept of this is that he took what Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote, and he built on it the deeper dynamic. He was going beyond just the works and documenting the narrative and the teaching and the history. Rather, he took it to the depths in which Jesus was teaching, the person of Christ in his essence, and what that means for humanity as a whole. That's what John was doing. He took the spiritual end of this. Now, notice this is consistent. This goes well with the statement made by Burskog that the eyewitnesses were as much interpreters as observers, meaning they weren't just writing what they saw, they were actually writing what was seen and what that meant. So if Jesus says, I am the bread, or I am the true vine, that's great to document, but what does that mean? Well, Jesus told his disciples what that meant. And so what John did is he found himself being not just a writer of the events, but an interpreter, pointing us to the Old Testament, showing us the fullness of Christ and who he was through the Isaiah prophecies, through Jeremiah's prophecies. That is what John did, and that is consistent with the testimony here. Consider Jerome, John, the apostle whom Jesus most loved, the son of Zebedee, the brother of James, the apostle whom Herod, after our Lord's passion, beheaded, meaning he's talking about his brother was beheaded. Most recently of all the evangelists, wrote a gospel, meaning he was the last of them, at the request of the bishops of Asia. Again, consistent with the Muratorian fragment and what we just read. But this is where I want to focus on Jerome. He goes a little bit deeper. Why? Because there was false theology about Christ. Cerinthus, or the Cerinthian sect of Gnosticism, had permeated the end of the first century. And this is where First John comes in and hits harder than the gospel. But the very beginning prologue of John is consistently deteriorating this concept that Jesus did not pre-exist time, his birth, and that he was at the beginning with God. They disrupt this in this teaching of Gnosticism. Well, John comes in and says, hey, as an eyewitness, we've seen him, we've heard him, we've touched him. Because remember, the Gnostics don't believe that God would ever become a man. Anything physical is evil. And we'll talk about that later when we get to the Gnostic Gospels. But against Cerinthus and other heretics, and especially against the growing dogma of the Ebionites. Again, remember, the Ebionites seem to corrupt Matthew's gospel. No doubt. They use his as a primary. So it could be that John was also responding to the Ebionites by their distortion of the gospel message itself, who assert that Christ did not exist before Mary. On this account, he was compelled to maintain his divine nativity. There is said to be yet another reason for this work, and that is when he had read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he approved indeed the substance of the history and declared that the things they said were true, but they had given the history only 1 year, the one, that is, which follows the imprisonment of John, in which he was put to death. So passing by this year, the events in which he had set forth by these, he related the events of the earlier period before John was shut up in prison, so that it might be manifest to those who should diligently read the volumes of the four evangelists. And so what he's saying is they only covered a highlighted 1 year testimony of Jesus. And so what they're doing, what he's doing, is filling in the gaps. Again, that is consistent with the others that we've read. Now, with that, let's take some interesting traditions that come in later. Victorinus in the late 3rd century wrote that of the earliest commentaries of the Apocalypse. Now, particularly in Latin. Justin Martyr wrote one. We don't have much of what these guys wrote on those things, but Victorinus was one of the earliest, and his is in Latin. And it's interesting that he tries to give us the dating. This is, now notice my phrasing of this, it's the later traditions, but they're trying to say in this commentary that John wrote his gospel after the events of the apocalypse. Now, oddly enough, he's not the only one that says that. Epiphanius said the same thing, states that John wrote his gospel account after the apocalypse, refusing his humility to write a gospel, was compelled by the Holy Spirit to do so in his old age when he was over 90 after his return to Patmos. Now, oddly enough, he believes that perhaps it's indicated that Claudius was around, so that he's indicating almost that John was written when Nero was still alive, which would, a lot of people use this phrase to go, see, all four gospels before the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. The problem with that is there, he's saying that John is 90 by that point, which means that John, if this was during the time of Nero when it was written, John would have been a very, very older guy by the time Jesus's ministry began and ended. He would have been close to 50 at that point. And that's just not indicated at all. And for John to have continued on to the times that we see him in the apocalypse, which would have been at the end of the century, that would have put him pretty far in age beyond human expectancy, especially in the 1st century. 90 was great. But if this is the case, we have some confusion. And again, this is why we don't take this as Bible and we don't take it as inspired. These are fathers. Many of them have opinions. We're looking for consistency and we're looking for evidence that we can corroborate. But we don't see that really here. But he does indicate it's after the apocalypse. Some of the manuscripts that cover the anti-Marcionite prologue add the phrase, while John was still in the body. And then here's the added phrase, after writing the apocalypse. Now, that's a minor read. It's not accepted as original. But again, there are weird indicators in later traditions that John actually wrote his gospel after the book of Revelation. Whether that happened or not, it's still hard to say. I do think it was late. I do think they were close to each other in time. I do not believe either were before the time of 70 AD. I know I have friends who differ with me on that. I just cannot go along with that narrative. And I'm going to give you reasons why when we hit this section. Let's close up with the inclusio eyewitness. So those are the external evidence. We're going to touch just a little bit of the internal. We'll take some questions and move on. Bauckham gives a few examples that I'd like to elaborate and build on when it comes to the inclusio eyewitness. We did this with Mark, and we're going to look at it here with John. So in Mark's, Peter was the primary eyewitness, and we see that trend is followed even in Matthew's gospel and Luke. Star witness of the 3 gospels of the synoptics is Peter. That is no longer the case when we hit John. He is no longer the primary star witness. He is important, but he is not the primary star witness. In fact, he is the first and last. So John, rather than Peter, is the first and last disciple to appear on the scene, though at first he is definitely left anonymous. In chapter 15, verse 27 of John, it indicates that the witness was with John from the beginning. And that was one of the things that had to be relayed in there, that these witnesses were from the ministry of John the Baptist forward. Acts 1 just tags into this as well. That was one of the qualifications when they were trying to decide to replace Judas Iscariot. Still consistent in chapter 15, verse 27 of John. And that in view of the literary parallelism that is in chapter 1, verse 35 with later revealed Andrew, and yet still that anonymous disciple that were called to Jesus first, you see the parallels later in chapter 21, verse 2 and verse 7, where the writer gets the last word in chapter 21, verse 24 through 25. So we don't know who the anonymous guy is, apparently, in chapter 1. But if we actually follow the parallel view going into the end of the book, from the prologue, going into the first stories of Jesus, calling those two disciples after John the Baptist, and then we look at these two disciples and these others that are on the ship sailing away and fishing, we see parallels, which would indicate that the disciple whom Jesus loved was both in the story, that he is both in the very end and he's getting the last word, and he's one of the anonymous, leaving himself anonymous, whereas Peter is the last name mentioned and the first name mentioned in Mark's gospel. John is the first and the last in his gospel. So this is that inclusio eyewitness testimony that Bauckham speaks of, where the writer is putting himself in the narrative as the primary witness, showing by him starting and ending the account. He's the first and the last witness. He's the first indicator and the last indicator of testimony and statement or being brought up. And that's exactly what we see in John. In this anonymous disciple, it appears that that anonymous disciple with Andrew, based on parallels throughout the rest of the book, it was John, the one who Jesus loved. And so he would have gotten the first word and not Peter. Peter didn't show up in chapter 1 until Andrew's brother invited him. Again, it's not that he's belittling Peter, but he's giving you indication that he is the primary source and witness of this account, not Peter. Peter is a second source, and he comes on the scene later. Peter is the last one that Jesus talks to up until John gets the last word and gets to say one more thing about Jesus in chapter 21, verse 24 and 25. Whereas in Mark's gospel, you have Mark giving Peter precedence by saying, tell my brothers and Peter about this resurrection. Peter was particularly named not with the apostles, but outside of the group. Why? Because he's a primary source. He's one of the first ones on the scene in Mark. He is the primary eyewitness, and we already looked at that. If you missed that, go back and watch the Mark account. The beloved disciple gave witness to Jesus before Peter became a disciple in chapter 1 and continued to bear witness after Peter, because Peter would die. And he talks about what death Peter would die, which indicates that Peter was already dead when this was written, which is, again, why I put this in a post-70 AD timeline. He not only spoke of the Peter's death, but how he would die, which would have taken place around 68 AD. And so, to me, John's gospel is clearly after 70 AD just on that alone. There's many other reasons, but just on that alone, it's clear that it's after 70 AD. But let's continue. Let's consider some other things in this account too. John seemed to unveil names that the synoptics were protecting. We'll call this protective anonymity. It is also a term used by Bauckham and others. And let's look at some of the names that are revealed in John's gospel, but we're not in the synoptics. This one is the most astonishing to me. Mary, the one who anointed Jesus's feet, is mentioned in John 11:2, and the story is revealed in John 12:3. Mark's gospel did not disclose her name, but acknowledged her act as so great that Jesus said, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Well, then that's some high honor right there. What this woman did will be so well known that where the gospel is proclaimed in the world, this story will be told in memory of her. The problem is Mark, Matthew, and Luke did not tell us who her is. There is no name. Go back to the stories of this in the synoptics. She is not revealed. Her name is, how could she be famed in the world for this when they don't know who she is? Or is it that she was being protected in her identity because of who she is, which John will tell us why later. And by the time John's writing, it doesn't matter anymore because she's probably dead. So are they protecting a name here? So why is this significant? Since John does not tell the story until later. Now, remember this. If you're reading John chapter 11, verse 2, you find out that she is the sister of Lazarus who died. Now, John is telling you that she is the one who anointed Jesus's feet in verse 2, as if you already know the story that he doesn't tell you until chapter 12, verse 3. How are you supposed to know that she's the very one that anointed Jesus' feet when he doesn't even tell you she's the one until chapter 12, verse 3? Simple. He's assumed you've read the other accounts. He's assumed you know who she is, which indicates that the churches knew who she was. So why didn't the writers mention her name if she was to be so famed? Well, it could be she was being protected because she was the sister of a wanted man, Lazarus. Keep in mind, in John's gospel, it's clear after Lazarus, who he's the only one that mentions that story, was resurrected from the dead, they were trying to kill him. He was on a hunted list because he was a living, breathing example of the power of the resurrection of Jesus on earth before his own resurrection. He was a wanted man. So let's follow that trend for a minute. Let's just say I'm right. Let's put Lazarus as one of these guys being protected by the synoptics, specifically Mark. You say, what in the world? Lazarus isn't mentioned. He's only mentioned in John's gospel. Well, let's roll this out for a minute. This could be related to the last example, using Lazarus being the brother of Mary. There's one more example of this connection in the story of the Garden of Gethsemane. Bauckham indicates that this is possible, as do I, that the unnamed man in Mark 14:51 who ran away naked was Lazarus. It wouldn't be Mark, as some would suggest. Now, if you remember back in our story of Mark, there's only one time Luke and Matthew do not mention the story that while they were in the Garden of Gethsemane, there was a man there who was grabbed by his garment and it was pulled off of him and he ran off naked. Some have the conclusion, well, that's Mark. Well, remember what Papia said. He said that Mark neither heard the Lord nor followed him. I do not believe it's Mark. I believe that in the same way he was protecting Mary, he was also protecting somebody else, Lazarus. Here's why I believe that. Why else did they seize him, this man that's unnamed, along with Jesus, but not the rest? Remember, the rest of the other apostles were not arrested. They were not seized. Why was this man in Mark's gospel, recorded by Mark on the testimony of Peter, why was he seized? John and the rest of them were not taken away. In fact, John freely walked up to the cross right in front of Roman centurions. Peter warmed his hands at the campfire. He was worried about being caught, but he was just worried about his own self, which we'll talk about in a minute. So where in the world does this story come in where there's this anonymous guy who is so scared that he's willing to run out of that garden naked than to be caught when the rest of the apostles were not? Could it be that this man was wanted as much as Jesus was wanted, and that the centurions and the guards of the high priests come along and they find both guys on the wanted list? They wanted Lazarus dead. They wanted Jesus dead. Could it be they seized both, but one of them slipped away, and so much so that he slipped away and ran off naked? Could it be that Mark may have been protecting this family? He did not reveal Mary. He did not reveal Lazarus, but later on, John unveils some of their names. Lazarus, he unveils in the resurrection story and tells us why this dude is hunted down, because he is a living, breathing testimony of the resurrection power of Jesus. He reveals Mary that none of the other gospels do, assuming the churches already knew who they were because they were already dead by the time John was writing. Lest you think I'm crazy, consider this in addition to these examples. He did the same thing for Peter and Malchus. I put C and D together because he did this for Peter and Malchus in John chapter 18, verse 10 through 11. He being Peter and Malchus were left unnamed in Mark, Matthew, and Luke in the Garden of Gethsemane accounts when Malchus's ear was cut off. Have you ever noticed that? Read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Read the story in Gethsemane. All three accounts lack both the name of the man who was cut off his ear and the man who cut off the ear, Peter. John had no problem telling us who the two people were. John unveils his name here in John 18:25 through 27. Both of their names. Both of their names. That is so important to us. That John was, it seems to be that these synoptics were protecting people that were alive. Think about it. If Peter was the perpetrator who was attempting to swing a sword at a dude, just missed his head enough to cut his ear off, and one of the accounts tell us that Jesus picked that ear up and healed it, saving Peter a disastrous attempted murder, because Jesus pretty much helped the dude put the ear back on to protect Peter from being a criminal. And if we go to the later story in John's gospel in chapter 18, we have Peter sitting around the campfire, and he's asked the question, hey, I think I've seen you. You've been with Jesus. Were you with Jesus? And he says, no, I wasn't. And then he denies. But John tries to inform us that one of those questioning Peter was a relative to the one whose ear was chopped off, who he had already revealed to us was Malchus. So what that tells us is Peter was not only scared to be associated with Jesus, but that he was afraid that he was caught and that he was seen as the perpetrator, the one who attempted murder in the garden. He was afraid he was spotted by somebody who had seen him swing his sword at a man, a person who served the high priest. You're in trouble. If you're seen as an attempted murderer, you're in trouble. And he was afraid somebody spotted him as the one who swung the sword. They're like, no, I think I saw you in the garden. And that one person that asked that question was a relative of the dude whose ear got chopped off. But Matthew and Mark and Luke didn't tell us that. Why did John? It could be, and I believe, that they were protecting those names like Mary and Lazarus and Peter and Malchus, because Peter having documents circulating with his name on it, a swinging a sword at somebody, is pretty much giving evidence and admittance to the fact that he was trying to kill somebody in the garden. So this was protecting. And it could be that by the time John is writing this, Peter's already dead, so it doesn't matter to unveil his name. That John is writing that Mary and revealing her name because she's already dead and she's not related to a guy that's being hunted down anymore, and vice versa with Lazarus for that matter. It could be that the protection is unnecessary because they're no longer around, because John's writing this many years after they lived. So these are things to consider, and we have much more to go into as we consider these scenarios. With John's gospel, we're going to go more intrinsically. We're going to look more at the internal evidence next week. But this was external and just beginning the stages of the internal. Now, what we'll do is we'll try to go through some of these comments if I can and see if there's any on here. We have just a few minutes. Thanks for tuning in. Please share this and subscribe to the YouTube channel, the Facebook channel, and share with your friends. And then we'll go through different questions, not just during the live feed. We do our best to follow afterward as well. One question that came in, Finding Truth, explain, what do you think about this quote from Irenaeus? John, the disciple of the Lord, who leaned back on his breath, published the gospel while he was a resident of Ephesus. Yeah, again, this goes, it's worded a little bit different, but I posted that phrase in there. And what that indicates is that he's identifying, not only is it John, because there's many Johns in the Gospels and in Acts, but that is John, the one who was described in the account as being one who laid on Jesus' breast. If you're questioning which John it is, it's that one. That's what he's trying to tell us. And that there's actually a point in time where he's writing. He wrote at a specific time when he was in Ephesus, which is important to the fact that the style that he is writing in is very similar to that which we see in other places. Ephesus would have had tremendous writers and scribes, and he would have had numerous at his expense while living in Ephesus, a very educated area. Let's see here. Question. We believe epistles written prior to the Gospel of John. Yeah, no doubt. John would have been one of the last. In fact, I think John was probably written between 80 and 90. I'm not going to die for it, but I do not believe it's before 70, and I just gave numerous reasons why. But I do believe it was somewhere between 80 and 90. I think the apocalypse was somewhere between 95 and 98 during the time of Domitian. There's numerous indicators of that. I know some of you out there, my semi-preterist friends who just have to have it before 70 AD to make your eschatology work. I cannot let history slide on the basis of my presupposition of eschatology. I know it causes problems if we put it there, but there's really not much evidence. And I know people try so hard comparing to the Roman Empire, but keep in mind the Roman Empire was not just the highlight of Jerusalem in 70 AD. There was much more that considerably went on and on and on for the next couple hundred years. But just the same historically, I think that's there. I think the epistles of First John was written probably around the same time as the Gospel of John, if not shortly after. And some would say it was even before, but I'm okay with either. And I continue to argue the fact the second and third John were written by John the Elder, not by John the Apostle, which was another eyewitness of Jesus, who was a friend of Papias. But definitely Pauline epistles, many of the Pauline epistles would have preceded the Gospels, especially given the fact that I believe Luke would have been around 56, 57 AD. Matthew would have been translated and published in Greek with a fuller gospel in the 60s. So I do believe that many of Paul's epistles would have been done. I think that Paul was writing Second Corinthians, or our Second Corinthians. There were many other letters we just don't have, while Luke was writing the Gospel of Luke. So there's no doubt. Galatians, for example, First Thessalonians, First Corinthians, I believe would have been before many of the gospel accounts that we have. So yeah, no doubt there are epistles that would have been. I think James is earlier as well. Let's see here. Amen. This is awesome. Never mind my question. I guess I answered that question for you, Santi. Same beloved. We need someone to pick up the torch and start the new non-tax exempt church in America to take on the. Okay, yeah, sure. That's got nothing to do with what we're talking about, but whatever you need to say there. Eusebius says John was talked into it, and he tried to fill in blanks not covered by synoptics. Yeah, again, and I point that out. I do think there is an element here where he was motivated to do so. Remember, these guys are probably orators more than writers, but they saw the necessity, and they picked up that mantle to do it. Let's see here. Stay on topic. Thank you, Slam RN. You're my hero. You always have been. Let's see here. I want to go through some more of these. Good discussions today in the comments. How significant is the constant use of the beloved disciple within the book of John itself? Again, I think it's a code name for himself. Remember, and we're going to talk about this more next week. First century writers, when they're doing a biography, do not just come out and say, I'm John. And I know that's what we want them to do because that's what all the Gnostic texts do, which we'll look at when we get in the Gnostic text. But that's not the goal. They're not making themselves a point. We showed places where Matthew put himself in the text, giving himself the epithet. We looked at Luke, leaving indicators of him as a physician, or in Acts, for example, we put the wheeze in there, but never identified himself particularly. Why? Because they're not making the story about them. They're leaving you inclusio eyewitnesses like Peter did Mark and John did in his own gospel because they're not making the story about them. They're not the hero. The biography is of Jesus. And this is not just something that the Gospels did. This is consistent. Josephus wrote this way. He talked about himself in the third person in his writings. Xenophon did the same. There are numerous writers in the Greco world, in the Greco-Roman world, who wrote this way. Lucius did the same thing. And we'll talk about that more so next week, just to throw that in there. Let's see. Nick says, now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being weary in his journey, sat thus on the well. Thus means like this, showing it was dictated and acted out. Yeah, I mean, and again, these are good points on the internal side of the Gospel of John that indicate to us consistency of a writer and an eyewitness testimony perspective. So again, great point there. Which letters are believed to be John, son of, not to be John, son of Zebedee? Again, I would say second and third John are the only ones that are indicated that way. We see that particularly in Jerome's statements, as well as it seems to be indicated by Papias. Let's see here. I always thought the naked man was Mark, but was unaware of Papias' words. Yeah, most people do. And that's a great point. Thank you for pointing that. I've heard that myself too, but it's like, actually, most people affirm that Mark was not eyewitness of Jesus. He was not a hearer. And not just Papias. I read Papias. Others indicated the same thing. But yeah, I don't think that he was as well. But once again, thank you for those. There's many more here we don't have time to touch on today, but thank you for joining our podcast. Please share this with your friends. Share this on social media. Leave us some feedback even afterward, and come back next week and listen in as we go into the internal evidence. We started some of that today, showing the Gospel of John, and we appreciate your support. Thank you, grace and peace to you.